All right. Welcome, folks, for yet another episode of Hanger DX podcast, where we talk about everything related to developer experience. And today, with us, we have Jonathan joining in, and we will be talking about the case against standardization. And I'm really interested in having this conversation and learning more about this. With that, without further ado, Jonathan, please introduce yourself, and we'll get started with that.
Thank you so much for having me on this podcast. My name is Jonathan Magen, and I'm a computer scientist. My top three areas of inquiry have really been distributed systems, security compliance automation, and I dabble with domain-specific languages when I get the chance, which is a lot of fun. And, it's not necessarily that I'm against standardization. I think that would be a foolhardy thing. I like that the screws that I can use in my house all accept the same screwdriver. I like those sorts of things. It's merely that I think that natural efficiencies do not emerge under aggressive standardization as we hope that they would in the software world. I don't think that evidence has shown us that they emerge as readily as they do in the manufacturing world. So I guess you could call me a little bit skeptical, if that's fair.
All right, so let's dive straight into standardization. You already touched on that as a topic. So I have obviously my own opinion on what standardization mean, and there's like this whole concept of like paved paths in developer experience space, which is also picking up a lot. But maybe I would love to, given that we are talking about standardization and like challenges or like limitations of it, I would love for you to describe what is your understanding of standardization. How do you think about standardization as a kind of like concept in DevX?
So I would ideally, in the ideal case, I would probably define standardization as the pursuit of consistency. And usually it's for the benefit of developers to help keep certain aspects of their jobs predictable. And it can also be very good for software itself. To quote John Ousterhout, consistency is a powerful tool for reducing the complexity of a system and making its behavior more obvious. When that system is the company and work itself, there is absolutely a sense in which some standardization can be enabling constraints, to quote my mentor, the veteran educator, Dr. Stephanie Height. It can be a set of enabling constraints in that case. I think that the problem comes when standardization gets taken too far. It can get dogmatized. And one reason this can happen is that a company wants to treat its developers as interchangeable pieces, and I don't approve of that. So really, it's about extremes, right? Because if you have, I don't know, 7 messaging platforms, right, for message queues, if you have 7 of them, that's extreme. I get it, right? On the other hand, one messaging platform is also extreme. It just happens to be in the other direction. So really, I'm against extremes.
That's interesting. So I know we talked a little bit about, or like you shared some of the material about standardization. I also read through that, right? Like for instance, if you're using Postgres as a database, like it would not make sense for somebody to adopt into like MySQL, for instance, right? And
Right.
vice versa, right? That like many of these tools and platforms are, I would say, similar in capabilities. So when we think about like standardization, one thing which also that particular section was talking about was, this whole idea of unknown unknowns, which was kind of like one of the reasons they brought up is like, maybe using some of the boring technology or as the term was, is still meaningful because as developers, we always try to be optimistic. We think about like, oh yeah, like we know how to configure this. We know kind of like how this system is supposed to work. But there's always going to be these unknown unknowns that will appear once you get into the weeds. So when we think about like using new technologies, using new ideas, how should one think about it? How should we kind of like think about these are the standard tools we should use versus investing into different technologies, different systems?
So I think it depends. I'm going to give the typical computer science answer and say it
Sure.
depends. But truthfully, it depends. What does it depend on? Right? Well, it depends on the pressures that you're under. If you're in a position where you can spend time sharpening the axe, which in my opinion is almost always time well spent, right? At least in my opinion, in my experience, it's almost always time well spent. Then that's great. But we all know some people work in feature factories. Not every shop is willing to let you do that. And even if there's something that'll make it better, the short-term cost outweighs the long-term gains in that circumstance. So I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to come in on a high horse and say, hey, man, I have all the answers, because I do not have all the answers, right? I can speak from my experience. I think that there are a couple models that we can look at. One is the boring technology model, which uses innovation tokens, which I think is a really cool way of sort of budgeting for change and improvement. I think that's something really neat. I think that the rest of the, let's call it the manifesto, which is really well written, and there's a presentation that accompanies it. The rest of the manifesto has gotten, I think that's been taken a little too far, and it's actually stifling improvement, because people are like, well, no, just use boring technologies, and then nothing ever gets better. And that doesn't feel like that doesn't have a good feeling to me. So I think that's one model, the innovation token model. There are other models of sort of innovation and ways to think about this. There's the pioneers, the settlers, and the town planners model, which I think is really interesting. And there's a lot out there. There are people who've written on this really extensively, and I don't say that I would, I would never say that I would be the one to sort of regurgitate or even paraphrase their work acceptably. I'm sure that there are plenty of people in business schools, MBA professors and so on, who would take on that challenge. But I don't think that I really would take on that challenge.
So I think maybe for the audience who hasn't listened to this, one, I will share some of the links in reference so people can read through it. But for reference, if you want to maybe describe, like in a couple of lines, any of these concepts as a baseline for people to understand some of the things we're talking about.
Sure. So the innovation token model, which is the first one that I spoke about, is one in which you have sort of a change budget, a change and improvement budget, however you want to sort of summarize this thought. And the idea is that you set some limits on the amount of change, because listen, any system can only absorb so much of change. We've learned this time and time again throughout systems research. So if you have a team, that can only absorb so much change at once as well. And so you budget for that, you set a limit for that, and you set goals that are appropriate to that situation. So you can sort of calibrate. I have I don't know, let's say 20 innovation tokens this, I don't know, quarter, right? Therefore, I can do this much change, and you sort of contain its blast radius, and hopefully experience a lot of success by making things better, right? One example of making things better might be, hey, listen, we're a JVM shop. We've historically used Java, the language, and we want to start bringing in Kotlin because it allows us to express certain data transformations, or it allows us to do something that we couldn't do before. Great. Budget for it, plan for it, make sure it gets in there. That's a great model, right? I think the opposite of that, what I would object to, would be saying, you know what, we're a Java shop, and it's gotten us this far, so we're going to stick with it. We're going to do it. That's the way it's always been done. And that's really what I would object to. The second model is the pioneers, the settlers, and the town planners. And just a real fast explanation of that is that there's sort of three classes. The people people tend to sort themselves into those classes, which is really interesting when you start to look for it. Of course, you could come up with many shades of gray between the classes. I think that the pioneer model would be sort of the people who are always trying new things. They're always on the bleeding edge. They're always trying the newest, greatest thing, right? Sometimes it works, like, pioneering sometimes works, and sometimes it does not work, and that's okay too. Then you have the settlers who come in, and they are the ones who sort of systematize things. They take the successes of the pioneers and they make them more consumable. And then when they finally become commonplace, or I would say, and I'm going to use this word loosely because it's within the context of one company, but potentially one firm. When they become commoditized, right? Those improvements become commoditized. Those capabilities become available more broadly. Then that's really where you have your town planners. And there are people who love that. There are people who love being pioneers and love going, oh man, that didn't work, and oh, we should try that. There are people who love that. There are people who are settlers who go, how can we make this consumable for more people and operationalize and productionalize this? And then there are the people who come in and say, well, now we got to do the next phase and keep it stable and everything. And it takes all types, and that's a great thing. That's not really a flaw, right?
Interesting. Let's just call it innovation, given that you also brought up innovation token. Let's just call it, from an innovation perspective, if somebody wants to bring in new tooling, new capabilities, do you think it's typically the platform teams who are kind of like coming up with these ideas? Do you think it's kind of like coming from all software engineers? Do you think, what is kind of like the motivation behind even start thinking about like, okay, we've been using Java for some time. Let's just try like Scala or Kotlin, right? Like, how is that even coming up in the discussions where we're saying is like our current standards don't really uh, meet our needs?
So you asked two questions, which are really interesting because they're very much intertwined. The first, I'll take them backwards. The first thing is um, about innovation, and I think that there are. I mean, look, I'll be honest. Good ideas can come from anywhere, right? Anyone can have a better idea than someone else. That's like the fun part. So when you have too heavy governance and too heavy centralization and too heavy standardization, that can chill innovation because innovation definitionally means coloring outside the lines, means doing something differently than the way that we do it today. It means we're going to make something better in some way. You're going to optimize it in some way. And optimization obviously means you're either minimizing or maximizing something. Okay. So that's really cool. Um, I think that it can absolutely chill innovation. I think that there are ways to have, enabling constraints, to quote Dr. Hyde again. There are ways to have standardization that has constrained choice that allows people to sort of say, hey, I'm going to pick the best of these options for my problem at hand. And those options can be fantastically boring in and of themselves. It doesn't have to be exciting and shiny. There just needs to be some optionality so that you can make the best match you can. And I think that before I can answer your question about platform teams, I would need to ask you, can you define platform for me?
Sure. So again, we've had done in a podcast that like there is a variance in definition of platforms. Generally, platform teams, are considered the entire organization which is managing both DevOps and DevX. So in a way, kind of like infrastructure that everything runs on in production or like even staging for that matter. Plus, like now DevX, which is sort of like everything before things hit production. So sort of like how you manage your like Git servers, like how do you kind of like manage your CI/CD pipelines? So that's kind of like part of the DevX. And how do you even manage like your IDEs and cloud environments, stuff like that? That's DevX. Generally, at least in my mind, I think about platform is essentially collection of both.
So that makes a lot of sense. So in that sense, using your definition, which is I think appropriately broad, right? Like it makes sense for it to be structured the way that you structured it. Um, I think that sometimes it can be the platform teams that end up bearing the brunt of it. That's part of the job of a platform team is to say we're going to absorb the pain of something so that everyone else can have it easy. That doesn't mean you abuse them. That doesn't mean that you don't respect their work and take care of it, or take care of that organization. Um, I think sometimes it can be the platform team. Sometimes it isn't. Right. Quick story: I worked at a shop, and we ended up creating um, an automated setup, an automated configuration utility for developer machines. That was sort of like aftermarket. So after the company sent it to you, you ran the software on it, and it gave you a little menu in the console, and you picked the modules that you wanted, and it just boom did it for you. And it took like a 2-day process and turned it into like a 20-minute affair, right? Mostly watching a progress bar, which is always fun. I love a good console progress bar. I don't know who doesn't. Um, and that was really cool because that became popular enough that it ended up being a community source, inner source project, right? Where different teams contributed their best config tweaks or tool sets to the greater good. And in this particular case, it actually became so helpful that the official endpoint support team that was supposed to maintain it, they gladly looked the other way, right? And they were really excited about that possibility. So sometimes it comes from platform teams, and sometimes it just comes from users of the platform who go, hey, this is a rough edge. Let me smooth it out, right? And that's a great opportunity for collaboration. Especially because I'm sure you've seen this before, but you don't want any two teams to end up in an adversarial relationship. So if you have a way to work together, like actually collaborate on stuff and share it out, man, that's ideal. That sounds great. I love those instances.
Interesting. So this brings to kind of like maybe even trying to define where we are seeking optionality, right? Like there are many different dimensions when you think about like optionality and like the whole development stack today, right? I kind of like noted down some things where there's like obviously programming languages. Programming languages has historically almost like more so than speaking languages, spoken languages, have been debated on, right? Everyone sort of like has passion for certain programming languages, and people really try to evangelize these things. And obviously, there are like IDEs, there are CI/CDs, there are docs. There's like infrastructure, like do you want to use Postgres versus MySQL? Um, I'm just curious, like are there certain dimensions where optionality makes more sense versus others, right? Like for instance, if you're using Python as your primary language, would it make sense for you to also start using Ruby? And kind of like you can kind of like start making the same arguments between Postgres versus MySQL. Kind of like there are some places where um, the capabilities may be very similar. That I don't know whether, like, again, I would want to take your opinion on whether optionality makes sense there versus things that you were describing where you actually introduce a new way of installing an software for developer machines to kind of like make it easier for them to, I don't know, install a bunch of different dependencies that they need for their regular day-to-day workflow. So is there a way where we think about these are the things where it would make more sense to have optionality versus other places where it doesn't make as much sense?
I think absolutely there are places where it makes more sense. I think that it's probably reasonably going to vary by organization and circumstance. However, I'll take your example, right, of Python and Ruby. Those are two radically different languages, although they both happen to be interpreted and they both happen to be used a bunch for web development and a bunch of other things, right? So those differ. Those may have similar capabilities in some respects, like you said. They vary dramatically in terms of approach, right? So I don't know if that would be optionality. I mean, unless you have a circumstance where you're really using Python effectively for, I don't know, something else. Let's say an analytics use case, right? You use pandas or polars, and that's like your thing, right? But then you're like, well, nothing's better for the web than Rails, because that's the problem space that you're in. So Rails solves your problem. So, sure, use them both, right? I think that getting to the heart of your question, there's a support cost to all of this, and that's something that I sort of mentioned the boring technology manifesto. That boring technology manifesto that alludes to this also, that there's an operational cost for all of this, right? And you got to weigh that operational cost. I think that when it was written in 2015, we woefully underinvested and underemphasized the importance of operational concerns when running systems. And God bless ops teams who carry the pager and so on and so forth. Fast forward almost 10 years. And I personally, with the advent and popularity of site reliability engineering from Google and production engineering from Facebook and so on and so forth, I still think that there's an upsetting industry trend where we underinvest in and underemphasize operational concerns. I don't think that's really gone away. I think we've gotten better at it, but I don't think that it's gone away. And if those are your concerns, you have to balance that. You have to say, okay, well, what are the things stopping me from improving, from innovating? You can call it innovation, you can call it improvement. I think they're two different things, but sort of what are the things stopping us from getting better, from leveling up our practice? What are the things stopping it? And if one of them is operations, cool, invest in that, get over that hump, right? Make that less painful for everyone. Another example might be architecture. Have you seen people, like, in terms of technique and architecture, have you seen people standardize that? And what does that look like?
That's interesting. I mean, in some ways, you can still say things are getting more standardized towards like Kubernetes, for instance, in terms of like infrastructure, right? Like, so you can argue that there are like other different ways to run and scale your infrastructure, but like Kubernetes is now becoming a more standardized way of doing these things. So do you think people should still find alternate ways of running it? And if so, like, what would be the way to think about that as sort of like, a way to invest into?
So if you have a problem that Kubernetes solves for you, use it. If you don't, then you're going to be absorbing a tremendous amount of complexity long term for using a platform which doesn't solve a problem that you have. Now, what I just said, you can take Kubernetes and you can substitute almost anything in computing for Kubernetes, and that statement will still probably hold true, right? Don't use it if you don't use it if it doesn't help you, right? Like, should not be radical advice. but I guess it is, right? I mean, listen, man, same with microservices, right? People are like, oh yeah, let's use microservices. Do you have a problem that requires microservices to solve? If you do, you know it. Use microservices. If you're doing it because you think it's cool, man, you just opened up a can of headache on yourself, right? God bless your ops team once again.
That actually brings to another point, right? Like I think we as developers are generally very opinionated, right? Many times it's also not just why it's like whether it's solving an interesting problem. It's also sometimes about these are my favorite tools, or these are my favorite languages, these are my favorite practices, and I'm going to bring it here, right? So I think one of the best examples is actually docs. I was hearing this interesting saying from somewhere. Is like, your cost of the SaaS subscriptions that you pay for all these different docs that your team uses can be sometimes even more than the cost of your infrastructure running your Kubernetes instance, right? So um, yeah, I mean, like, we have obviously Google Docs, we have like wikis, we have like Notion, we have like Coda. There's like at least 100 different services that can help you manage your docs today. And honestly, even if you ask large organizations, there isn't many times they don't have standardization. They will probably have like 20 different doc services used internally. And like, is that kind of like, providing that optionality, is that like even worth it? Or are there places where you should draw a line?
20 things that do the same thing in a company of reasonable size is probably overkill, right? I'm the first to say it. You have 20 things. Come on, what are you doing there, right? Consolidate a little bit. Find a couple of the best ones, right? But at the same time, I would say that one doc service for a company of reasonable size, if 20 is overkill, one is underkill, right? So again, I'm against that
Hmm.
extreme one size fits all thing because I've seen it go bad. And I think nature teaches us genuinely about the dangers of monocultures, and there's transport of structure from nature into software. If your entire company is using, just for example, for the sake of argument, a single message queue platform maintained by a central team, that's a single point of failure. The same for one type of database and one cluster, et cetera, and CI/CD. We wouldn't accept single points of failure in our production systems. Why do we accept them? Well, I mean, sometimes we do inherently, right? If you only use one product, also don't forget it's not just about uptime. If you only use one product and the company that provides that to you, that vendor gets bought by an unfriendly competitor, that also introduces tremendous risk. Then there's the financial incentive to using, I'll say, two vendors, but really more than one vendor, and negotiating properly to get yourself a better deal by saying, hey, vendor co is giving me this deal on this thing, and you have half the company use that, and half the company use the other one, and you sort of don't put all your eggs in one basket. I think that's a sensible thing to do, right? In terms of ameliorating risk.
Interesting. This kind of like reminds me of this saying is like, it'll be immature to use multiple cloud providers when you're a small company, and it'll be immature to use single cloud provider when you're a large company. Uh,
That I'm sure that this is being studied, and I cannot wait to see the paper that sort of looks at the financial spending, expenditure trends, and sort of surveys companies and finds out, hey, because that seems like a heuristic, the one you just mentioned. That seems like a heuristic that would bear a lot of fruit, right?
right.
I'd be really curious to read about it.
Yeah, but like I think I still want to double click a little bit and maybe even challenge you, especially when it comes to things like docs, right? Like I think, does it really make a difference if you have multiple different doc services in your company, right? I feel like it's probably easier to only stick with one and just expand onto it, just because it makes it easier for you to kind of like search information through it. It makes it easier to kind of like have that kind of an experience where it's like, oh, like if I'm looking for this particular service definition, I can just like go to my Google Docs or whatever that doc service is. I'm not prescribing one particular doc service, but like in some places I would still say, like especially when it comes to docs, is like it might make still more sense to actually have just one service, because for the most part, like, there isn't features or capabilities which are very much tied to one particular service, right? So I don't know whether having multiple services, you're actually getting additional capabilities there.
So I think you're right, and I'll tell you why. Um, I don't think that one is impossible, right? I don't think that 20 is preferable, right? I think it has to do with proportionality to the diversity of problems that you're tasked with solving. So if all of your documentation use cases are solved by one product, I salute you. You're very lucky, right? Enjoy. And there's always going to be the team that that wants to keep their docs in a folder, a directory in Git in their source repo, and that's just where their docs live, right? I'm sort of not talking about them. I'm talking about proportionality, right? So if you have a variety of documentation or any kind of problems to solve, you're going to require a commensurate, proportional number of different tools to solve those different problems. And I don't think that's an outrageous thing. But is it conceivable that someone could do that in a docs environment? Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of docs, a lot of docs services, like you said, right? So maybe we haven't found the one yet, but it's conceivable that someone could create that, and it's conceivable that someone could find a perfect match for their situation, and it gets them really far. My only question then would be, what are you putting in there to ameliorate the risk of being entirely dependent on one vendor, one platform? And then the other thing I would want to know is there an escape hatch? So if you build a good escape hatch so that someone goes, hey, we have a docs use case that isn't covered by, DocuWow or whatever the new service is, right? They all have crazy names. I kind of love it, right? Like if you go, hey, we've used DocuWow for 4 years and it's been great and it's met all of our needs. It's not meeting this need. What do we do? And there's a good escape hatch there, then you're fine, right? I worry about people who, say like, ooh, you can't color outside the lines because then they're never happy with it. They're going to swatch you down, right? And they destroy it. I also, you mentioned preference earlier. I don't think it's about preference. I think it's about effectiveness. And I've seen engineers feel disengaged when they have to use substandard or otherwise use tools that, that don't make them be and feel productive. And I think that that's a bigger deal, right? Now, obviously, preferences can leak in there. If you're more productive in one editor or language than another, you're going to have a preference for that possibly because feeling like you're making progress is an important part of work. But yeah,
Interesting.
I agree with you.
I mean, I understand, you mentioned a little bit about, if you have multiple different services, like if one of the services goes down, you still have availability and reliability of rest of the systems, or you're not entirely just tied to a single point of failure. There's a flip side of this coin too, right? If you work with 10 different services, there is a 10x higher probability that something goes down.
Sure.
So
You're right.
How do you think about this balance? Is it better to have 10 services where one of those goes down, or is it better to have one service which can probably take down your entire system?
I think it depends on your constraints, but ultimately I would say 10 is probably too many in the hypothetical world with no details that we're constructing, right? I would say probably 10 is too many, right? I'm not saying we should have 10. I'm just saying maybe rethink one and don't be super heavy governance fascism, in the workplace against people who say, hey, what do we do? We've run into this new situation, right?
Right. Interesting.
That's, yeah.
And how do you think about this tool fatigue, cognitive load, when you have so many tools, obviously, as again, going back to platform teams may have to maintain some of those tools for the wider product engineering team, or you have to do regular updates. You have to kind of update your IDEs, update your programming language versions. There are third-party dependencies. You have to update all of those things. I think to some degree, one of the arguments of standardization is you helps kind of make some of these processes a bit more horizontal, where you just update one time if you're using monorepos, for instance, and everything gets updated. But there are also challenges around it. But going back to the question, how should one think about fatigue and cognitive load, if I would say it's a little bit more wild west in terms of actually using these tools?
Well, there has to be a middle ground between you're going to do it this way and wild west, right? There has to be a middle ground between those two. Just like you mentioned the highway and the sort of gravel dirt road. There's a lot in between there. There's every street in your neighborhood. There's their service. There's just a lot of things in between there that we can look at, and it's up to every team and organization to find the right place on that spectrum where they can find the right balance, I think is a word that you used earlier, right?
Yep.
And I think that's really important. Cognitive load is something that I worry about as a distributed systems guy a lot. I worry about that a lot because it is way too hard to build these systems well. We have languages which don't have any notion of distribution. Their execution model differs from the way that they're going to be. The language model differs from the system model radically, right? It takes so much effort to get functional correctness, let alone security, right? We just need to make all this easier. There's too much for one person to keep in their head.
Hmm.
I heard someone really dunking on AWS earlier, right? Because there's a million services which do everything and there's cognitive load and everything. Yeah, this is a problem. This is a problem throughout our industry. There are, how many NPM packages now? How many Python packages now? Cognitive load is an issue across the board. I don't have a solution to it. I'm just sort of saying, be sensible, right?
So, kind of like a second aspect of this question then is how do you think about, is there like any kind of framework when somebody's thinking about like, oh, let me try out this new technology or new service? How should they even evaluate whether it's worth trying it out? Or is there sort of like, one way, like we were talking about, like, highway and off-roading, right? Like if somebody really says like, okay, even starts asking, okay, we want to go off-roading. What should one think about when they want to go off-roading? Are there kind of like, decisions or like thought process behind it before they kind of like make that leap?
From my experience, the mechanism or method, or if you want to call it process, you can, for sort of off-roading, has to be baked into the engineering culture, from my experience. So saying, hey, if you have a problem that is just solved, is not either not solved by these tools, or this tool is not solved by that, or it's solved so poorly that it's remarkable, right? Like, here's what you do, right? Like, first things first, and that can be like, ask for help, right? I've seen places where you mentioned Python earlier, right? Where Python gets really slow because it's a very interesting language. It's not a fast language necessarily. Where you can hit a performance issue with Python. And then I've seen people drop to languages like Rust or Go, right? So there's sort of an escape hatch, right? You can say, hey, we hit a performance problem. I know we're a Python shop, but we hit a performance problem. What do we do? You can drop down to a sort of one of these new memory safe system languages, and they've been really effective at being called from Python. Zig, I know people, get very excited about. Rust, same thing. I think there's a lot to be excited about it in that community.
Okay.
So having a process and a mechanism and that, again, escape hatch is really, really important.
Got it.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so it kind of like makes sense, right? In some ways, you're saying is to deviate from the standard tools. Let's start with an argument. Let's start with kind of like making a case for it, right? I don't think it should be just everyone goes and figure out their tool themselves. Like
Certainly not.
we should really
No.
focus on like what is the value that we are creating, what are the gaps that we are filling when we are going on this off-roading.
Yeah, exactly right. Think about it, right? Weigh the pros and cons. Just don't get biased in the, well, this is what we've always done. This is what we know, right? Because that really chills that argument, that chills the, and also, no one wants to use, like, you risk turning away the people who have a real passion for this if you're just like, you're going to do it this way and you're going to like it, right? Like, one size fits all. Okay, buddy, right? Like, good luck hiring and keeping awesome people with that attitude, right? There has to be, there's a smaller piece here in terms of effectiveness that we can talk about, but there's also a piece about fun and joy and liking what you do, and that gets to developer experience also, right?
Right.
If you hate your job and you hate your, if you hate your job and you hate all the things that you have to do every day, that's gonna take it out of you, man.
Yeah, kind of like now we're talking about effectiveness as well. How do we know if we're kind of like doing this again, off-roading for that matter, that we're moving in the right direction? How do we find out that the efforts that we are making to create that optionality, that it's producing the right results?
So for that, my gut impulse is to first say that the proof is in the pudding, and you look at the quality of solutions. Maybe you pick, I don't want to go crazy. I know the last episode was against metrics, uh, maybe you pick a way of assessing your progress, right? And you sort of look at those success criteria objectively. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that that's also a business question, which I'm not really qualified to answer because I'm not a business guy. So, maybe some of the people who've written about those innovation models will be able to answer that more broadly, probably using the terms core and dominant logic and strategy and other things that they like to say.
Okay. Kind of like moving a little bit towards takeaways. So if there's a somebody listening to this conversation who's like, oh yeah, like we've kind of like pushed back on anything non-standard for the last 5 years in our company, like what would you say to them is like a way for them to think about creating that balance? What would be sort of like an advice for engineering leaders or like again platform teams to empower this innovation while maintaining some sort of standardization or maintainability?
So I think that obviously it's going to depend on the situation there, but having the conversation is the first step. Saying, how do we make sure that we are an innovation friendly culture? How do we make sure that we have sufficient optionality so that people don't feel like their hands are tied when they get to a hard problem that we frankly need them to solve, right? And I think that there are a lot of engineering leaders out there who do a really good job of looking at this. I think that for senior leaders, making sure that it's clear from the top down that good ideas are valued at a company, right? Maybe you have a, I don't know, monthly or quarterly, like everyone's like, hey, here are the cool ideas that we came up with, right? And circulate that up and get that some time with senior leaders in your technology organization or your business organization, right? Again, good ideas can come from anywhere. I hate to see that potential wasted. So sort of building in things that acknowledge and incentivize the potential of people to do well, I think is a great thing. And there are a lot of engineering leaders who do that really, really well. When it comes to specific technology choices, again, having that conversation is huge, baking it into your culture, making it clear that, yeah, we're going to talk about this. One thing that's really interesting to me they're not architecture decision records. I forget what they're called, but oxide computer, RFDs. They call them requests for discussion. And they're managed through Git. There's some really cool RFDs that have been made more or less public through blog posts, and this is sort of how they do consensus-based decision making in their company. And it's a really great model that other people can learn from, even if you're not going to take it whole hog. There are pieces you can take from it that I think would be really beneficial in terms of getting those creative juices flowing.
So companies who talk about standardization today, right? Like, I mean, standardization is a pretty common concept in many of the large organizations. Um, they're still doing innovation. They're still kind of evolving their tool, right? For instance, there is these days the AI coding assistants, like a bunch of AI tools for test generation, all of those things. There are ITPs, so there are like new tools being introduced. So I want to at least separate out this conversation where we're talking about standardization versus we're talking about bringing in innovation through modern tools as well, right? Is there a different way of thinking where we are talking about optionality?
There absolutely is. And you see internal developer platforms, right? You're talking about developer platforms. Those can be enablers for sure, right? Like anything else, they can also be used inappropriately. I'm sure you can see how they could be used as sort of a policing and enforcement or maybe even a surveillance mechanism, right? And that indicates a culture problem that happens to have a technology symptom, right? It's not necessarily a technology problem. But yeah, there are a lot of companies that are innovating, and I think that it would be great to get a peek in to how they manage these things in within those really cool companies. Not the ones who are adopting like quote unquote AI and large language models. I don't view that as necessarily a worthy goal. I get an email every other week from a company. They're saying, "Guess what? We have a new AI feature," and I'm like, "You make pots and pans. Why are you doing? Like, why are you doing? You're sticking AI in where it doesn't belong." Uh, you know, so I think that there are a lot of companies that I really wish would be more transparent with the market and their shareholders about how innovation works there and how they balance it. Because I think that there's a lot we can learn from them.
Interesting. So, just to summarize, kind of like our entire conversation, well, I'll try to. But we're saying is, I don't think it's like too completely different arguments. In some ways, I feel like we're still saying is standardization is useful with creating opportunities and places for people to continue innovating still, right? Like, I think there is an aspect of, if you're using a source control system, maybe you don't want to use more than one. I don't know. Like, I mean, maybe it can provide more optionality there too. But to some degree, this should not become a limiting factor. To some degree, this should not become a bottleneck for developers to innovate and keep on improving the status quo.
Yeah, if you use one and the one that you picked is not meeting your needs, consider another one, right?
Right.
Absolutely. I don't think we're very far away from that. If you want to know what I'm opposed to, it's taking things too far, right?
Right. Right.
In either direction. I've seen companies where heavy governance has been tried for the last decade and it doesn't work. And you know what they say the solution is? More heavy governance. And I'm like, guys, come on, just take a step back, right? Like get somebody in the room with fresh eyes who's going to say, well, maybe heavy governance hasn't worked. Maybe doubling down on what hasn't worked is not the right thing, right? Yeah,
Okay. All right, Jonathan. I know we can go on forever. There is a lot of different things to cover in this, but you've definitely created an interesting conversation. I would love for us to maybe even figure out like how this evolves into an industry and how this evolves into leaders thinking a little bit more or like double clicking on standardization. So thank you for engaging and intriguing us with this idea, and would love to learn more and share more notes as we move along this industry.
that sounds great. Thank you so much for having me on the show, and thanks for your questions. They were great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan.